My name is Benjamin Quinn, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm so excited to welcome you to tonight's event with Tina M. Campt, discussing her latest book, A Black Gaze, Artists Changing How We See, in conversation with Sarah Lewis. Tonight's event is part of our ongoing virtual event series. As we remain digital for the time being, we're so excited to continue the work of bringing authors and their writing to our community during these difficult times. Especially now, it is through the support of authors and our beloved readers that we can continue to make events like this happen. So thank you so much for showing up for us week after week. For tonight's event, we will conclude with some time for your questions. If you would like to ask the speakers something, locate the Q&A function wherever it may live on your Zoom display, where you can submit all of your questions. We'll get through as many as time allows. If you go to the chat section, I will shortly be posting a link to our website where you can purchase your own copy of A Black Gaze. If you already have a copy of the book or would like to contribute to this series and our store in a different way, I will also be posting in the chat a link to our website's donation function. We greatly appreciate any and all support you are able to extend to us at this time. Please note that closed captioning is available for this broadcast. Depending on which version of Zoom you are using, you may need to enable it yourself. Simply locate the button marked Live Transcript on your display and click through all the options. And one final note, as you have probably no doubt experienced during virtual gatherings this last year, technical issues might come up. If any glitches do occur, I will do my best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you so much for your patience and understanding. And now it is my absolute pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Tina M. Campt is the Owen F. Walker Professor of Humanities and Modern Culture and Media at Brown University and a research associate at the Visual Identities and Art and Design Research Center at the University of Johannesburg. As a renowned scholar of visual culture and identities, her previous publications include Other Germans, Black Germans and the Politics of Race, Gender, and Memory in the Third Reich, Image Matters, Archive Photography in the African Diaspora in Europe, and Listening to Images. Tonight, she is joined in conversation by Sarah Lewis, an associate professor at Harvard University in the Department of History of Art and Architecture and the Department of African and African American Studies. She's the founder of the Vision and Justice Project and is the author of several books, including forthcoming projects examining the work of Carrie Mae Weems and a book on race, whiteness, and photography, all from Harvard University Press. This evening, they'll be discussing Tina's latest book, A Black Gaze, Artists Changing How We See, a powerful and pivotal examination of several Black contemporary artists that Tina Holden of the Studio Museum in Harlem calls at once an incomparable critical inquiry, a rapt personal itinerary, and a cadenced poem, a work which opens the mind and eyes to some of today's most transformative Black art and artists. Focusing on artists working with a variety of mediums and contexts, from the intimate portraiture of Deanna Lawson to Arthur Jafa's stirring videos of Black daily life, A Black Gaze explores the images that shift the very nature of our interactions with the visual, demanding an active witnessing that is active, visceral, and involved. We're so excited to be hosting this event tonight. Without further ado, I'm now delighted to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is all yours, Tina and Sarah.
Thank you so much, Benjamin. Tina, Professor Campt, it's a thrill to be here with you.
Likewise, it's such a joy to be here with you.
I got so excited I turned my camera on early. Well,
no shame in that game.
That's really a pleasure. Well, I'm grateful to be here, as I mentioned, at this event hosted by the Harvard Bookstore to salute my colleague, Professor Tina Campt, and her new book, A Black Gaze, Artists Changing How We See, published by MIT Press. I'd like to just open with some brief remarks and then turn it over to Professor Campt, who'll read from A Black Gaze, excerpts from it, before we speak together, and then take questions from all of you. So thank you all for joining us on this virtual event. Well, this is an innovative, powerful book that argues that Black labor and the labor of Black artists has resulted in new ways of perceiving the joy and struggle of variegated Black life. Now, a question you might all be asking if you haven't yet read the book or had the pleasure of doing so as I have is, what is a Black gaze? Of the many who have bestowed praise on this book, the scholar who has really done the most in the last century to not only produce scholarship, but to define the field of Black photography, Dr. Deborah Willis wrote that Dr. Campt answers this question by merging, quote, the sensory of the sonic, the touch, and the optic, end quote. This is a book that questions whether we have grappled sufficiently with how bodily, how haptic, and how tactile our act of looking may be. One of the many gifts of this book is that it centralizes the idea of a necessary provocation. What kind of response is required for viewing Black art made at this particular moment? It's a book that also takes her own provocation seriously, crafting a model of writing that exemplifies a new form of freedom for describing the experience of witnessing, engaging, and being transformed by a work of art. In it, she also continues her investigation of the sonic, the bodily, and the haptic mode of looking as implied by her use of the terms throughout to describe what one might consider chapters, but that she calls verses. After the prelude, the book opens with a series of 6 verses and a reprise at the end, looking at the works of artists from Dina Lawson to Arthur Jaffa. In this methodological and fixation on the sonic as part of this sensorium, she resonates with the many conversations about Black art and popular culture that have expanded into a near chorus over the last few years, if not decades. This is a book that is both urgent and necessary. One need only look at the shift in the display of practices in museums and galleries in the last even 12 months to say nothing of the last few years prior to see the implicit statement being made that yes, the works of many Black artists do provoke a different responsiveness, as Professor Campt might say, that might even require a reconsideration of how we consider, of how we respond to art writ large. The nature of that response moves us past what we have called the, quote, politics of reception and opens up questions about whether the term and the power dynamic implied in the term reception is sufficient. There's a second reason, though, for the urgency of this extraordinary book. Today, we've had a convergence of the hypervisibility of the work of Black artists, increasingly shown, increasingly exhibited, despite the fact that these works, these extraordinary works, are often under-theorized. When you study the work of even the most celebrated Black artists, as I noted when I finished the MIT Press October file on Carrie Mae Weems published this year, you often find that Black artist work is over-exhibited and under-theorized. And this has created an asymmetry between acclaim and the discourse on their work. This has all sorts of consequences for market value, yes, but for me, most importantly, their place within history. So it is a true honor to be able to celebrate this book and Professor Campt's innovative model of writing, which we'll speak about more in a bit. Tina, it's a pleasure to be in conversation with you. Congratulations and thank you. Oh, you're on mute, I think.
Mute. Thank you so much. Thank you for the wonderful words, for the wonderful introduction, and for the reflection. I have to share with this audience what I shared with Sarah earlier in the week when we spoke, is that not only am I delighted to be in conversation about the book, but I'm also delighted to just be having an overdue conversation because Sarah and my work overlaps and is in so many ways in conversation that this is a really welcome opportunity to be able to talk, not face to face yet, but at least, seeing one another. So thank you so much for that wonderful framing. It is also, I also have to thank the Harvard Bookstore for hosting us, for grappling with me with the unexpected limitations of PowerPoint as they confront us in this virtual world. Thank you, Benjamin, for your warm welcome. And last but not least, I am simply delighted to be able to share a short excerpt, to read a short excerpt of the book with you. And I'm looking forward to speaking both with Sarah as well as to answering any questions from the audience. And please feel free to post those questions in the Q&A box at any time while I'm speaking or thereafter. I'm going to read, the excerpt that I'm going to read is from the first chapter of the book, which, as Sarah described, I refer to in the text as verses. It's one of 6 verses, not including a prelude and a reprise. And I will say that I call them verses rather than chapters because the intent was not so much to try and analyze the work in a highly academic way, but instead to try and express it and to give expression to the responses and the responsiveness that they demand. So this particular verse focuses on the work of an extraordinary African-American photographer who many of you may know because she was the first photographer this year to be awarded the Hugo Boss Prize, and that is Dina Lawson. And for those of you in the Boston area, you should also know that her Hugo Boss show will be coming to Boston in the fall to the ICA. So you should take advantage of seeing some of the images that I'm going to be talking about, actually all of them. This verse is called The Intimacy of Strangers. And now, as I told you, I'm going to be relying on the help of Benjamin to cue the PowerPoint of images that I could not cue myself. So Benjamin, first slide, which is just going to be a title. Okay, and here we go. I made my first studio visit, actually my only studio visit, only one of them, prior to visiting, I'm going to start again. I made only one studio visit prior to my arrival at the Brooklyn studio of award-winning photographer Dina Lawson on a blustery August afternoon. And I was pretty nervous about the fact that the artist herself would be there watching me and my curious way of writing. It's a method of writing Lawson herself gave me words for when she invited me to visit, when she described it as, quote, a studio practice of writing. Rather than writing about artworks, I spend most of my time at exhibitions and galleries sitting with and writing to them. I write to them about the feelings they solicit, the forms of discomfort they evoke, the emotional work they require and often demand, and the potentially transformative effects they have when we allow ourselves to inhabit those feelings and those responses. Seated cross-legged on the floor is my go-to position for writing to art. Writing to artwork from the floor, or in this case, an artist's studio, minimizes you as a viewer and maximizes the work itself. Looking up at it both breaks up and breaks down some of the traditional dynamics of spectatorship and visual mastery. And when the subject of that art is Black folks, challenging the dynamics of spectatorship and visual mastery is an extremely important intervention. Next slide. A muscular young man paired with a partial view of a companion who shares the space seated next to him on a couch. They occupy a tiny front room packed with furnishings, objects, and images that fill the compact space of a home that seems almost too small for its occupants. One man cradles an infant in his oversized hands. The other flashes an oversized wad of cash in an equally oversized hand. A nude, bronze-skinned Brazilian woman lies in the classic repose of a 19th century odalisque. She drapes herself over salmon-colored concrete steps against the backdrop of identically colored walls. Snaking from waist to thigh is a tattoo that guides our gaze past a nascent baby bump and down her long legs to rest on an ankle, with ankle shackled by a strap and the unmistakable metal box of an electronic monitoring device. An older Black woman in a cherry red suit perches on the arm of one of 2 massive and clearly overloved couches in Rochester, New York. On the couch next to her right sits the matching accessory to her fabulous ensemble, an extravagant red hat befitting a treasured matriarch, or dedicated church lady. Seated to her left and sharing the couch on which she perches, her daughter nods off peacefully beside her. These were some of the images that hung on the walls of Dina Lawson's studio on the day I visited. But before I sat and wrote to them, they insisted that I walk with them. They're photographs that beckon us to travel with and alongside them. They cannot be engaged passively. They demand an encounter. As I stood before them, as I walked and lingered in, between, and among them, I felt them watching me, taking me in and taking me into the spaces of their homes, through the stairways, hallways, and rooms they inhabited and traversed. They are images that beckon you into their places of work, in the club, on the street, or somewhere else altogether. Lawson's photographs draw us into a world of strangers to whom we feel intimately connected. Lawson's prints meet you eye to eye. To view them is to engage in a face-to-face dialogue and be challenged to withstand the force of their penetrating gazes. Eschewing the historically elevating function of portraiture to cast its subjects as superior to others, Lawson's images render her subjects as equals. They're photographs that invert the normal rules of spectatorship and spectacularity. Rather than viewing them, we are viewed by these subjects. Instead, rather than scrutinizing them, they scrutinize us, and we're captured in an inscrutable and inscrutably powerful Black gaze. The gaze is a weighty term that has emerged most forcefully and been appropriated most widely in the field of cinema studies and in feminist film theory in particular. It is a term most frequently cited to articulate the structure of visual spectatorship and pleasurable looking, specifically who gets looked at, how, and at whose expense. Commonly understood as a gendered dynamic of spectatorship, centered on voyeuristic or narcissistic pleasure in looking, the classic definition of the gaze defined the white male viewer as the bearer of the look, and the white woman as an object to be looked at. This widely embraced understanding of the gaze is invoked well beyond discussions of screen culture as a shorthand reference to a dominating act of looking that domesticates and objectifies women as well as non-white subjects to serve the pleasures of a white male spectator. The concept of a Black gaze that I'm proposing departs from these ideas in important ways. The idea, or my idea, of a Black gaze disrupts the equation of a gaze with structures of domination by refusing to reduce its subjects to objects and refusing to grant mastery or pleasure to a viewer at the expense of another. A Black gaze rejects traditional understandings of spectatorship by refusing to allow its subject to be consumed by its viewers. A Black gaze transforms viewers into witnesses and demands a confrontation. In Lawson's work, it is a confrontation with our discomfort in embracing Black life imaged so unapologetically on its own terms. When we participate as active witnesses in this confrontation, the gaze we encounter creates complex and contradictory forms of intimacy. Lawson's photographs bring us into intimate contact with individuals frequently overlooked or marginalized as insignificant, members of the working class, or of impoverished Black and brown communities whose struggles are palpable in these images. Unlike the typically passive dynamic between viewers and traditional portraits, these are images that stage an eye-to-eye reckoning that creates forms of intimacy that are not about pity or identification. Neither voyeuristic nor narcissistic, they stage encounters that require work. Next slide. We must work to confront our resistance to seeing flawed but beautiful bodies of Black women who refuse to be shamed as they display themselves publicly with dignity and purpose. These images capture women posed in striking geometrical shapes that accentuate the elasticity of flexible bodies. They're photos that echo the long history of Black women's contortions to sustain families and communities against all odds. Lawson's photographs create equally complex imaginings of Black men. They are men who hold babies and partners with passion and pride. They are men who flaunt cash regardless of its source. They are men who wear regalia of royalty in impoverished settings that lack any indication of grandeur. Next slide. Juxtaposing scenes of families gathering casually assembled in living rooms or on couches after church with those of nude dancers or fast girls, the photographs make us work to see the relationships depicted in and across them not as dissonant, but utterly connected. Lawson does not designate or anoint them with the status of revered or disposable, redeemed or fallen. She does not label or identify her subjects as one or the other. We view them unnamed and ambiguous, and in doing so, we are forced as a result to embrace them as our equals. In the process, Lawson creates intimate yet uncomfortable relationships by twinning the respectable with the profane and celebrating the dialogue between them. The intimacy Lawson's images conjure is a haunting intimacy among strangers. As viewers, we are privy to intimate settings, intimate bodies, and intimate relations between these bodies. Her photographs situate us as proximate to subjects we don't know, but who she brings us excruciatingly close to. Her camera's exacting focus creates a hyperclarity that reveals pores, blemishes, and the gloriously dappled imperfections of Black skin. We see as well the textures of fabrics, surfaces, and objects, the nap of a rug, the distressed weave of a worn-out couch, the fuzz on an old slipper, the texture of a wig or a weave, the sheen of a hat, the weight of a crown. The weft and weave of everyday life permeate Lawson's images. They capture intimate strangers rendered so vivid and so familiar that it is impossible to look away, except for those schooled to routinely avert their eyes from ordinary Black folks and the quotidian existence they eke out across the diaspora. The Black gaze that emerges in Lawson's work is a gaze that immerses us in a Black sociality that is simultaneously mundane and exquisite. They are images that bring together the diverse spectrum of Black communities across the globe, from Cuba to Haiti to Brazil, the US, Ghana, and elsewhere. Yet in Lawson's hand, these divergent images harmonize. I have somewhat infamously insisted that certain images require us not simply to watch or to view them, but to listen as well. Lawson's images of intimate strangers register at a frequency one feels deeply. They are images that do not speak. They are images that hum. Sitting on the floor of Lawson's studio, encircled by her life-size photographic subjects and struggling to meet their gazes, I felt the irrepressible hum of their collective hum. Thank you.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much. I thought what we might do is begin our conversation by setting the table a bit in a way that would allow those who haven't read the book and those who have to meet. And to do that, I thought I might ask you a question that's really born of the exuberance sort of that I find in hearing you read that verse. And that's a question about freedom. That's one of the main words that came to mind as I reflected on my experience of reading your book, freedom. The freedom that you arrogated to yourself as a writer, the freedom that potentially was there in the editorial process, and the freedom that hopefully others will find it as they read it and consider how they might locate their own voice in that way. And I wanted to just, if you don't mind, quote just a few sentences from your writing about this topic, just to see if you might speak to it. On page 20 in the prelude, you in effect speak to freedom when you say here, quote, here, I find it important to emphasize that this project did not begin with an intention to write about art. It was not initiated as a research project or a theoretical exercise. It became that on the basis of powerful and often quite serendipitous encounters with artists and their work. And you go on to describe how the work was born of that process, this liberatory kind of inductive method of writing. So I wondered if you could speak to how the detonations, right, of that experience informed the structure and the shape and the freedom of the book.
Gosh, that's such a beautiful way of opening up, sort of the impetus of the project, which is, I don't know that I would call it freedom, because that is such a capacious term, that I don't know if I feel entitled to it. But I know what you're getting at. And what you're getting at is something that I've grappled directly with, which is permission and agency, right? So I did a film series. I co-curated it with one of the artists that I write about, Simone Lee. And one of the questions that she posed to many of the guest filmmakers that we hosted in conversation was, how did you give yourself permission to do the work that you do? And I feel like you're asking the same question. How did I give myself permission to write the way I decided to write about what I wanted to write about? And it's a fundamental question for scholars, writers, and especially for artists. Where does that moment come when you say, I want to write this way? I want to say these things in a particular form that may or may not be the form that I am told I am supposed to take, or that is appropriate to the particular object that I'm engaging. And I have to say that it was the artists themselves that opened that door for me. The dedication of the book is to AJ, who opened the door, and Saidia, who pushed me through. And AJ invited me to write something for his catalog. And I was, why? I don't write about art. And he said, no, I want you to write. And then Saidia said, yes, you have to write this.
Yeah.
And so it is not necessarily a kind of self-authorization, but it is a kind of collaboration of being in conversation with artists and scholars who encourage you to embrace the modality of expression that you find appropriate to reach other people. And so I feel like so it's both this, both being able to engage the work on its own terms and the terms that are most appropriate to you, but also feeling justified in articulating something that you cannot articulate through another modality. And that certainly is a judgment call, but there's a moment of courage when you have to say, this is what I think I can contribute that will help us to understand why this work is important, and that addresses an audience that may or may not already feel that they have access to it. I hope that's a capacious answer to a capacious question.
No, it's a gorgeous answer, and I have in my mind's eye sort of two ways in which I want to go. One is the way I'd go if we were just talking, you and I, and the other is if we were doing the Q&A. But I think I'll merge them, in fact, because I think it's so crucial for anyone listening and for us to speak about the idea of permission. We are here at the Harvard Bookstore, and this is a book on MIT Press, and this is a work of scholarship. On the other hand, there is a license, right, that you've taken to be able to state what you think needs to be said in the way in which it needs to be said. Now, I think I'm rare in this sphere in the sense that I've worked before coming into academia as a curator and as a writer. And so my question actually was both about permission, but was also about the true lacing of your own exuberance and your own excitement about the work in the act of writing about it, which isn't always done, right? And that there's a freedom in that decision as well, which I think is exemplary and should be modeled more. So on that point about exuberance, I wanted to ask you a question about the word frequency.
That I'm exuberant about frequency, yes.
It is the nature of frequency to be exuberant if you're going to resonate on that high level, but you use that term as a way to describe in what you called your elevator pitch, what you're doing in this book, right? Arthur Jaffa. And I want to inject this term into the conversation because for those who haven't yet read the book, who I know will, I think the terms that they might be hovering around when they think of the title, spectatorship, the gaze, etc., don't fully get at, the full experience, right, that you are writing about, which is more about frequency. So I wonder, without saying more, if you might speak to why the term frequency and maybe resonance is so crucial for how you your active writing a Black gaze.
Right. Well, oh God. So there are a few terms that you flagged, which I just want to bring back, which is exuberance. Absolutely, that I do write from a place of exuberance. I write from a place of enthusiasm and passion because that is what the work does for me. In some ways, I don't feel like I'm an art critic because I don't write about art that I don't love. And that takes me to the second term you said is license, right? Giving myself license to do that. It comes from a place of exuberance and passion. Frequency. So yes, the piece that I read, the section that I read was about the gaze because I really, that's usually the term that confounds people. How can you talk about the terms Black and gaze? But you're absolutely right that I can talk about the concept of Black gaze by way of this other term of frequency that is very important to me, because you're absolutely right. It is about resonance, that it is about how do we connect to art and what does art stimulate in us? How does it move us? And for me, frequency is a sumptuous term that allows us to think about the connection that is made to us through multiple. My conception of frequency is that it's not just about things that resonate by way of the aural, right, by way of sound. It is about the way in which anything into which we come that makes contact with us, or that we allow to make contact with us, right? That contact is by way of vibration. That vibration is resonance. That vibration is response or responsiveness. And so to think about art making contact with us, or allowing us to make ourselves to make contact with the feelings, the responses that powerful artwork solicits from us, right? That is the overlap to me between frequency and a Black gaze. Because one of the things that I'm trying to say is that thinking about a Black gaze is not being able to see like a Black person, right? It's not being able to see through the eyes of a Black person. It is being able to be accountable to the responses that engaging with works that position us in relationship to the precarity of Black life trigger in us,
Yes.
and being responsive to that as opposed to suppressing it. That is Black gaze to me. And again, that is about resonating frequencies of Blackness.
I love this. And I've been wanting to ask you about frequency for some time. So this, you beautifully, gorgeously answered how I intuited that they interlocked. But you've raised in that, I think what I see as one of the main stakes of the argument you're making here, and I alluded to it in trying to dislodge the focus on the idea of reception, right, as a term, but responsiveness and the actions that looking can provoke, I think is become central in our conversations in the art world in the last year. There are many things to discuss in this score. I have two sort of related questions. And one takes advantage of the virtual environment that we're in. I could, of course, see other fantastic talks and conversations you had about your book, which is wonderful. You can't do that in person. And one of them was with Kimberly Drew at Politics and Curves. And in that conversation, she was really asking you about what I think might be on many people's minds as they think of what your book might contain, which is a discussion about the ethics of viewing, the kind of exhaustion some people feel when considering the sort of spectacle of Black trauma, all of these composite topics. You actually pulled back and said, I want us to be able to consider the moment before the exhaustion. And I wanted to see if we might pick up on that. Can you describe how you would consider the complex of actions that you both personally and kind of have seen the works that you discuss in your book catalyze, right, in viewers? Can you discuss what really the stakes here are in that regard?
Yes, stakes. That's the key word. The posing the question of stakes is posing the question of if we don't, right? We have options. We can go in many different directions. We can be exhausted. We can be cynical. We can be insensitive, inured. We can decide we've had enough, right? We don't want to look anymore. But there is an entire constellation of feelings, responses, moments of implication, moments of devastation, moments of trauma that precede that. And what I am inviting people to do is explore that precipice, that moment at which we often decide, no, that's too far. I'm not going there. I've been there, I'm not going there. And the way I'm asking people to describe that or to explore that is through artwork, right? That is not representing that moment of trauma in the way in which we've seen it, right? So, for example, Simone Lee's work, Loophole of Retreat 1, is a sound installation that abstracts the story of the extraordinary injustice done to one of the members of the MOVE community that incarcerated her and forced her to give birth to her child in a prison cell. And at the same time, right? So it tells the story of what got her there, but at the same time, what got her through, and the kind of community that she created in a prison ward, right? In a prison cell, to give her a moment of humanity to share with her child. We could say no. We could say no. But the way in which artists are able to present that to us, the way in which Arthur Jafa is able to thread right? To weave moments of Black euphoria, right? Euphoria at James Brown, at Michael Jordan, at Aretha Franklin, weave those together with, horror, moments of abject horror, right? And bring us to a tipping point and take us backward and forward. And so to come back to your question of what I have observed and where I've written from that moment of both being in that moment when responsiveness was demanded and trying to decide, okay, where do I go? What is my route? And watching people be there and watching people sort of decide, well, one response is, I need a moment. I need a moment. This is too much. This is too much. I need a moment to rest and prepare, and you need to prepare me. To which I say, who is prepared for this? Who gets that possibility, right? What kind of privilege? It allows us all to sort of pause and then go into this traumatic moment. And then you have the responses of folk who just, they refuse to see it. They decide that this is not what they want to do, but they decide. They have an anticipation of something. They have decided there is some place that they don't want to go without interrogating what they might gain from going there and whether or not what they might gain is truly destructive or may forge some kind of connection.
Yeah. I'm looking at the clock thinking, oh goodness, we're just having dinner talking together. But all along I have done my duty and I'm looking at these gorgeously composed questions from our audience, and I'll integrate a few as we speak, because one really does dovetail with the follow-up question I have for you now, which is in considering all of this, can you talk to us about your decision-making process regarding which artist you decide to include in the book, right? Because that equation, in effect, which it really is exemplified by Arthur Jafa's Love is the Message and the Message is Death, of being able to showcase the exuberance of variegated Black life, right, and struggle and pain, is one that there are many artists, right, who are creating what I've discussed as a kind of groundwork, right, in the era of stand your ground law for all of us. So you've hit on at an extraordinary set of them. What the question from the anonymous attendee here is, how do you select the artists who are discussed in the book? And that's really what I'd like to know as well.
It goes back to the quote that you read, which was, this book was not an intentional act.
Yes.
This book was cumulative. I started writing and then I decided that I needed to stop and it was going to be a book. Yeah. But truly, I started writing in response to works as I saw them. And it really was about cataloging those responses. And again, I did not begin this work saying there are a lot of artists out there who are creating this thing I call the Black gaze.
Right.
I started writing about the demands of certain artworks. And then as I kept accumulating those, I started to understand that they had something in common. And I started trying to articulate what that was that they had in common, or what that intervention was, what that kind of demand was. And that demand became a Black gaze. And there was a kind of artificial cutoff, which was that there was a timeliness.
Right.
To putting this book into the world and having people be able to look collectively and reflect collectively. And so that cutoff, it did not have to happen. I could keep writing this forever, but I decided that the timeliness of the intervention was more important than comprehensiveness. So the question that was posed is absolutely true in terms of, no, there is not a criteria that that eliminated certain people. It's also what you're saying about, there is a moment that we're experiencing. where not only is this work being produced, this incredibly challenging work being produced, it is also being embraced by, you know, the institution that is the art world right now. And that is something that is different. I am not saying that there was not something like this happening before people like Arthur Jafa or Simone Lee or any of the artists I talk about. But what I find is different is that we are now at a moment when it is garnering recognition, embrace on the basis of that discomfort. And that's saying something that I also wanted us to be able to think about right now.
Mm-hmm. It's crucial to mark that moment on the page in a publication. When I began by discussing that observation about the asymmetry between this sort of uptake and I would say over-indexing, over-exhibition, right, relative to the collection of Black artists and institutions, it oftentimes has come at the expense of the writing. And so to see, it's not so much that it makes just the book important, but what it also, I think, will create for the future viewer, scholar, interested person, 100 years from now, is some sense of how it impacted us.
Right.
How it impacted us. And to my mind, there are really very few other texts that offer in both ways that are both personal and political and communal, a sense of precisely what occurred, So it's why I love having the details about when you met a particular artist and what the weather was like that day and whether it was difficult to get there or not. And these, all of this complex of our own movements through the world will, I think, be as important, right, for how we historicize this moment as the analytical discussion, right, or the methodological inventions of a particular artist's work. So that's I'm glad we could get around to some of that. Just a bit of what I meant by the freedom question as well.
Yeah. I just wanted to respond to that comment that you made, which is that, the historicization, and we had a conversation that was part of our conversation as well about, your work and the volume on Carrie Mae Weems, and, to be able to see this moment in relationship to the doors that she opened and the way in which your work, this particular volume, is also marking what you talk about as a kind of elliptical responses, right? And I kind of wanted to not repeat the ellipsis, right? To take the work that you have done, and in gathering and and marking that, and to say, let's not do that again. Let's not do that again. So I think that there is that bridge between the historiography of work by artists of color and Black artists in particular, and its body, not reception in terms of ways in which people see or engage it, but who writes about it, who gets to have a catalog, who has an account of it that is continuous over time or spotty, right? And I'm just trying to intervene in the now so that we don't have to do that again.
That's precisely right. No, thank you for that. And for those listening, I mean, what we're also referring to is, MIT Press volume on Carrie Mae Weems that I edited with one of my graduate students at Harvard, Christine Garnier, a wonderful emerging scholar. That publication provoked a conversation between Carrie and I that I'll never forget, in which she said in a way that was just quite, stark and surprising and humble, given how celebrated she is there really enough scholarship to warrant a volume on my work? That was the question she had. And so it resulted in a dive into the archive, looking for what existed, realizing that there was this elliptical pattern, largely other artists writing on her work in the 90s, a large break in which there's silence on the record, or reviews, discussions in which she's part of group shows and reviewed as one of the many Black women artists in a show, effectively, to the current day. And so this book, A Black Gaze, and we can talk about the the choice of the article there as well, is very much a corrective and a model for the future. I don't want to not have sufficient time for questions that engage with the kind of the resonance of our own conversation. And the first one, I think I'll just add to our conversation now. It begins, this is a truly wonderful event. Yes, we're celebrating the extraordinary Professor Campt, it is. You write so powerfully about the contemporary artists who guide your thesis, while you develop this argument about the Black gaze as it's formulated by current artists. Did it change the way you looked at the work of more historical Black artists that preceded the work you reckon with? And you've just alluded to that in speaking about Carrie, but I think the question is asking maybe a longer time horizon, perhaps, in how they're considering historical. So I bring it into the conversation because history has set up very much the platform for this work, right? If it was once possible to write about vision, right, without even considering racial formation, it is not any longer. You can no longer do this. And that is thanks to the extraordinary work of the late Bergers, John and Maurice Berger, right? And Kelly Jones and Deborah Willis and W.J.T. Mitchell and many others. So in considering the kind of construction of the polemics and the politics and power of vision and race, a foundation has been set that allows for a different kind of flight, right, in considering a Black gaze. So how do you consider your relationship to the history that's preceded the book in terms of this kind of lineage here? So take that as you like.
That's an incredibly important question. I mean, the person that I would add to the list of folks that you just cited would be someone like Owen F, right?
Oh, yeah.
So, and that's part of where I see myself entering, right? I don't necessarily see myself entering as an art historian, but I see myself entering from that vantage point of not necessarily, documenting or analyzing a Black gaze but I see myself as what happens when we revisit work or literally just see it, engage with it from that perspective. And so, the recent show, posthumous show, Oakley's show at the new museum, right? Thinking about what his vision was and realizing that vision since his death, right? And I saw it, it was the first thing I saw when I could enter a museum after the pandemic, right? And its resonance, to be able to visit it after the summer of, George Floyd, right? That doesn't mean that the power of the work is either diminished or amplified. We see it differently.
Yeah.
And we have to talk about how our gaze has shifted on work that preceded this moment, but we enter it now through that framework. So I don't think that it's necessarily, I appreciate the question, I truly appreciate the question, but I don't find it as productive to think about how do I look back. It's how do I see it, how do we bring it into this conversation now, right? Because it has a legacy, it has a history, it has its moment of entering the world, but it re-enters the world now. And I want to talk about the contemporary encounter, given that history, right? And how have we changed, right? That's what's important to me.
Ah, gosh, there's so much more to say. We're going to have part 2, I think, in the future. There's one, goodness. I want to circle back around to your opening verse reading, but I do want to just salute the extraordinary vision of the late Owen F, whose show I did see too, as the first exhibition that I was able to physically see after the pandemic. the curatorial eye that you have, I think is sort of exemplified in your answer as well. But you're also speaking to the stakes of the project again, because ultimately when you're thinking about or engaging with the history of visuality and its contemporary force today, considering the history of race in this country, I think you're oftentimes pulled in two directions. You often want to consider the past, but then in thinking about the urgency of the current moment, realize that it's never ultimately past, right? And so there is that tension, but you're also pointing to the need to, well, in fact, a question from the audience, Brandon has sort of stated it beautifully. You're asking us to consider what you call the quote kind of haunting intimacy, right, among strangers, the sort of way in which there's a revisitation from the past that comes up in these intimate encounters, right, with works of art. I wanted to circle back around to Dina, though, to conclude a bit, even though I want this to continue for much longer. In her Aperture monograph, she has a conversation with Arthur Jaffa. And the final line of that is one that I'll never forget. And it occurred to me as I was reading your gorgeous book, because of the exuberance, because of the freedom, I'm going to call it freedom even if you won't, because I do think that you're entitled to that. And she states, I'm trying to locate the magnificent and have it come through in the picture. And in so many of our discussions about the ethics of looking, the struggle in Black life that's oftentimes centered in other discussions of what one could call a Black gaze, we don't often discuss how we can locate the magnificent, right?
Yeah.
And how it catalyzes the work. As your project, I think, just demonstrates so powerfully. So thank you. Thank you for that.
You're welcome. Thank you. Oh my God. We should do this again a lot sooner.
Where are we going? We're not going.
We're not going anywhere. We're locked down. So to all of the audience, we would like to say, part 2 will be forthcoming at some point. And the one thing I would add to what that beautiful quote by Dina is, I think that all of the artists that I write about are trying to locate and express the magnificent, but the magnificent in the ordinary. And not the magnificent in the singular. And that is something that is my guiding mission, which is, what does it mean to be able to give expression to the magnificence of the ordinary? And I think we should all strive to do that, because it is who we are. It honors the magnificent in every individual as opposed to in the exceptional.
Right.
So if there's anything that I can leave us with, it is that.
Yes, it makes for a marvelous read in reminding us that encounters, the seemingly ordinary encounter, can in fact be transportive. And this is what comes through for me most powerfully in A Black Gaze. So.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Oh, what a pleasure. Okay.
This was such a pleasure. Thank you once again to Professor Campt and Professor Lewis for this fantastic conversation. I hope that we are able to continue it in some form or another going forward. Thanks to all of you out there for spending part of your rainy evening with us. Please learn more about this incredible book and purchase A Black Gaze at harvard.com on behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Enjoy the rest of your week. Keep reading and stay safe, everyone. Thank you so much to both of you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.